All right, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. So, before I get into the more intellectually stimulating part of the episode, I just want to say that if you're going to leave a comment, you should come up with something more interesting than "don't quit your day job." Especially when the episode was about an interesting topic. It was actually about the Unabomber's critique of leftist psychology. So, if you're going to make an insult, make it something that's interesting and related to the video. Otherwise, what can I say in response? My response to that was, "Is that the best you got? Like, is that all you could come up with? You know, uh, Actually talk about the Unabomber's arguments or something like that, or tell me where I am wrong, or at least come up with an insult that's actually like, you know, worth reading, or something like that." So, anyway, moving on to the actual substance of this episode, I just had to get that out of the way. But today I want to talk about monsters, not movie monsters, not vampires or werewolves. I mean monsters as political objects, monsters as legal problems, monsters as tools that societies use to define what counts as human, normal, healthy, acceptable, and governable. Because if you follow Michel Foucault's work on power, especially his ideas about biopolitics and governmentality, you start to realize something unsettling. The monster is never just outside of society, the monster is actually necessary to it. It rationalizes the authoritarian aspects of society. They've always got to have some sort of outsider to control and manipulate and to base fears around. That's how these authoritarian tendencies in a given society function. And it, it's not like I follow Michel Foucault that closely, but I'm aware of the ideas presented, and it's an interesting premise here. Once you see that, the society requires monsters, you start seeing monsters everywhere. The in medicine, in law, in surveillance systems, in debates about gender, genetics, transhumanism, immigration, criminality, and public health. The monster becomes a mirror. It's a way societies reveal what they fear, what they value, and what forms of life they're willing to protect. So today I want to explore how the figure of the monster helps us understand modern power, especially what Foucault called biopower. So, Foucault argues that modern societies underwent a major transformation in how power works. Older systems of sovereignty were centered on the power of death. The sovereign king had the right to kill. Power announced itself through executions, punishments, wars, and spectacles of violence. But modern states increasingly shifted towards something different. Instead of simply deciding who dies and who lives, power became invested in managing life itself. Birth rates, public health, reproduction, statistics, and that is biopower, the administration of bodies and the management of populations. So I'm not going to argue that all aspects of, you know, what he called biopower are negative, are bad, but it is sort of the nature of modern power, or one of the primary aspects of it. But to manage a population, you must decide who belongs to it. You must draw a line between the normal population that needs to be kept alive and the abnormal threats that endanger it. And this is where the monster is basically born. You have the example that Foucault gave in his lectures on the history of the abnormal. Foucault points out that the earliest historical figure of the human monster was often the frame used to view intersex people. So, for centuries, Western law and medicine used the term hermaphrodite to refer to intersex people, and the term is now considered offensive. was it was a way to look at ambiguous biological sex characteristics as a violation of natural and divine law. So the hermaphrodite, as they called it, was viewed as a monster because their very existence broke the binary rules of society. They were a legal paradox, someone who could not be categorized and therefore could not be properly governed. And today, medicine and human rights advocacy have discarded the term hermaphrodite due to its stigmatizing and its inaccuracy and monsterizing history. The correct term nowadays is intersex, and intersex people are born with sex characteristics, including chromosomes, gonads, or genitals that do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. So the shift in the terminology to intersex wasn't just a change in vocabulary, it was in some ways a direct challenge to, the more violent aspects of biopower. It was a demand to stop viewing biological diversity as a monstrous medical emergency that needs to be corrected through forced non consensual infant surgeries and instead view it as a natural variation of human life. That sort of thing. So, as you may have noticed, today there is also monsterization of transgender people. The machinery of monsterization did not stop. So today we see this exact same script deployed by right wing ideology against transgender people. In conservative political discourse, transgender people are frequently treated as monsters in the most literal and Foucaultian sense. They are framed as violations of nature, threats to the traditional family, and contagions disrupting the social order. And the constant argument that's being trotted out regularly is that transgender people should not be allowed in women's sports, which is interesting because honestly, if you really cared about proper sportsmanship, you would divide sports simply based on a person's skill level and their achievement level. You wouldn't care at all what they have between their legs. And in fact, I mean, I'm going to say something that's not often said, but actually, we don't even need sports in schools, okay? Like, when it comes to that, a person, like a child, they could play games during recess as much as they want, but you don't need officially sanctioned sports in elementary school or high school. That's something that the kids could choose to play during recess. And really, the only need for adult supervision is to make sure that the kids aren't hurting each other while they're playing the games, you know? But of course, society has to valorize sports to an extreme degree to the point where it actually, is ridiculous. It's given an almost sacred quality. And you know, there's a simple solution, like I said, and that is just to have people playing sports based on their skills and their achievement level. That's it. That should be the end of the debate, really. So, by portraying trans people as deceptive, dangerous, or unnatural, ideological rhetoric strips away their humanity, and they are turned into a psychological and physical threat to children and ultimately to the state. So, that's why people will say that, the MAGA movement ultimately is aiming for a genocide against transgender people. And that is certainly the attitude and certainly one of the dangers of the far right in terms of policing gender and sexuality, of course, because they also want to, in many cases, not only ban gay marriage but ban homosexuality outright. So why does this happen? because biopower requires strict, legible categories to control reproduction and population demographics. The transgender body challenges the state's absolute authority to define and lock individuals into binary gender roles at birth. So, when a group resists this control, the dominant ideology monsterizes them to justify stripping away their health care, their legal recognition, and basic civil rights, which is something we are plainly seeing. And this process is called othering or monsterization, as I've called it, and it is a flexible political tool. It can actually be applied to any group at any time whenever a dominant power structure needs a scapegoat to consolidate control or to protect its economic interests. In fact, you might think, well, this could not possibly happen to me. I could never be otherized or transformed into a monster based on, you know, uh, based on my own background. I'm normal enough. I'm not, uh, I'm not a person who is typically targeted. Well, that's an interesting premise because, actually, interestingly enough, as a white person, believe it or not, there is a possibility that even you could be targeted. So let me explain because I'm a Finnish American, right? Uh, you know, there's an interesting part of the history of the Finnish American that actually verifies what I'm saying. So you can look back at American history to see how absurd and arbitrary this process is. Because take the case of Finnish immigrants in Minnesota during the early 20th century. Now, what am I talking about? So, of course, today Finnish Americans are viewed simply as white people. But believe it or not, in the early 1900s, Finnish miners, that is, people who worked in the mines, not underage people, but people who worked, you know, in the mining industry, and other laborers were heavily involved in radical labor unions, socialism, and anti-capitalist strikes. So, to crush this political and economic threat, the political establishment and corporate boss types began a campaign of, you guessed it, monsterization. And it actually went pretty far. In the early 1900s, particularly following major labor actions like the 1907 Mesabi Range strike in Minnesota and the 1913 copper strikes in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, where I live, even though I just mangled the word peninsula there. But anyway, corporate bosses and the political establishment utilized the courts and the press to equate radical labor organizing with racial degeneracy. That's right, Finnish Americans were actually accused of being racially impure. Even though most people consider Finnish people white, there was actually a movement in this time period to declare Finnish people non white. So this was a strategy, and the federal government had recently instituted strict anti Asian exclusion laws, most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act, and capitalist interests sought to exploit this framework. So, by successfully classifying Finnish immigrants as Mongolian, Asiatic, or otherwise non white, mining companies could legally strip them of their citizenship rights, fire them from their jobs without much public backlash, and potentially deport them. And boy, what does that sound relevant today? uh, it's not like there's a mainstream political movement that is obsessed with deporting people and denaturalizing people. So oddly enough, the whole MAGA movement, when they're doing those things and constantly pushing for that legal change, it's oddly enough echoing back to history that's strangely relevant to my own demographic of Finnish Americans. So here's what happened back in 1908, and a legal precedent was actually set. So this culminated in a federal naturalization court case in Duluth, Minnesota in 1908, where an immigration inspector attempted to deny Finnish immigrants citizenship based on this very argument. Corporate and federal prosecutors utilized 19th century pseudoscientific theories pointing to the Uralic or non Indo European roots of the Finnish language and features like epicanthic folds. Now, epicanthic folds are something that some Finnish people actually have, and it's a characteristic that can make their eyes look, for lack of a better word, more Asian. So I can verify that yes, there are Finnish people in my family who actually do have this feature. They actually look more Asian because of their eyes. And that was actually, no doubt, a part of their argument. And ultimately, the judge ruled in favor of the Finns, determining that they possessed white skin and were therefore eligible for American naturalization and citizenship under the laws of the era. So really, it's a little bit freaky to think about that, but that judge, um, oddly enough, by being racist in a certain way, nevertheless let Finnish Americans off the hook. So that one person decided, hey, Finnish Americans are actually white and therefore they're all right. So imagine if the judge had decided the other way. Well, who knows what could have happened? You know, it's a freaky thing to think about. But you know, Americans of a Finnish background, they might have been further otherized, basically. So, whether it's the historical framing of intersex people, the modern political targeting of transgender individuals, or the historical racialization of Finnish laborers, the tactic remains surprisingly identical. The monster is an artificial creation. So, you know, it's weird that coincidentally, this Finnish American example is shockingly relevant to the modern era. And it might sound like I'm bringing it up just because I'm Finnish American, and I'm sure that's a part of it. But to me, it's also interesting. I think I would find it interesting even if I was not of a Finnish background. So power creates the monster so it can position itself as the savior. It points its finger at the marginalized, calls them abnormal, creates new abnormalities, by the way, by over categorically examining people, and tells the public, give us more power, give us more surveillance, let us pass more restrictive laws so we can protect you from the beast, whatever the beast happens to be. But if Foucault taught us anything, it's that the real danger is never the monster. The danger is the system that builds the cage. And, you know, I'm not that familiar with Foucault's other ideas, to be honest, and I'll probably look into more of those. But, you know, if you disagree with something I've said here, feel free to leave a comment. I'm sure there will be some, comments that some people might make, and try to make them original, try to make them relevant to the talking points that I raised. And, well, that's about it. Have a good day.